"You're not family," my dad said. Grandma proved otherwise at my sister's party. Hey everyone, this is one of those stories that starts quietly but ends with a crown being placed back where it always belonged. Before the truth unfolds, take a second to ground yourself in this moment. Tap that like button if you believe every hidden queen deserves her reckoning. Subscribe if you are ready for stories where silence breaks into power. And welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where the overlooked rise and bloodlines are not erased so easily. This story began with an invitation that felt heavier than paper ever should. It arrived folded neatly, my name printed smaller than everyone else's, as if even the ink hesitated to acknowledge me. It was for my younger sister's birthday party, a celebration my family had been planning for weeks, a gathering meant to showcase unity, wealth, and carefully curated happiness. From the outside it looked like love. From the inside it felt like a test I was expected to fail quietly. I had always been the almost child in my father's house. Almost acknowledged, almost included, almost loved. My sister was the shining centerpiece, born when my father's life had already found stability and applause. I was born earlier, in the years he preferred to forget, in a chapter he rewrote without me. Over time that difference hardened into something cruel. Family photos were rearranged. Stories were edited. Achievements were downplayed. I learned early that survival in that house meant learning how to shrink. The party was not about a birthday. It was about presentation. My father wanted to show the world a perfect family, framed by music, catering, and curated smiles. I was invited because exclusion would have raised questions. Inclusion, however, came with conditions. I was to arrive early, help quietly, stay out of photographs, and leave before the speeches. No one said it out loud, but I felt the expectation settle into my chest like a stone. As the day approached, memories began surfacing uninvited. The years of being corrected in public, compared in private, and reminded subtly but consistently that I was different. Different tone, different mother, different place in his narrative. I had been told more than once, without ceremony, that family was about loyalty, and loyalty was something I had not earned. I had spent years trying anyway. What complicated everything was my grandmother. My father's mother had always existed slightly outside his control. Age had sharpened her silence into observation, and observation into memory. She remembered things my father pretended never happened. She remembered who showed up when money was scarce, who held the family together before it was fashionable to claim success. She also remembered me not as a problem but as proof. She had insisted on attending the party. Not because she loved celebrations but because she sensed imbalance. She arrived a day early, settling into the guest room with the calm authority of someone who had outlived manipulation. I did not know then that she was watching everything, cataloging gestures, listening to what was not said. The morning of the party unfolded with controlled chaos. Decorators moved through the house like invisible hands. My sister was dressed and praised, her laughter echoing freely. I worked quietly, arranging place cards, checking trays, doing the tasks that made the illusion possible. My father moved past me without acknowledgement, his attention fixed on optics rather than people. By the time guests began arriving, I felt myself fading into the background, exactly as planned. Relatives greeted each other loudly, exchanging stories that excluded me by default. Friends of the family glanced at me with polite confusion, unsure where I fit. I stood near the edge of every circle, present but unclaimed. It was during this time that my grandmother began to move differently. She asked questions that seemed harmless, about seating arrangements, about family timelines, about who was responsible for what. Each question landed softly but stayed where it fell. My father grew tense, though he masked it well. Control, after all, was his greatest performance. As the party reached its peak, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that told me it was almost time to disappear. I had fulfilled my role. Soon I would slip away unnoticed, preserving the image he wanted. I told myself this was normal, that survival meant compliance, that dignity could be practiced in silence. But something shifted. My grandmother took her seat at the center table, not assigned but claimed. Her presence altered the room's gravity. Conversations adjusted. Attention bent toward her without effort. She did not smile often, but when she did, it carried history. I did not know then that she had requested a moment later in the evening. I did not know she had brought documents, memories, and resolve. I only knew that for the first time in years, someone was looking at me with recognition instead of assessment. As the lights softened and the party prepared for its final act, I stood at the threshold between old patterns and an unknown outcome. I did not expect justice. I did not expect validation. I expected only to endure. What I did not expect was that endurance had finally been witnessed, and that the woman who remembered everything was about to remind everyone else. The music lowered, the room settled, and the air changed. The next chapter of my life was about to begin, whether my father was ready or not. The moment that followed was not loud, but it was absolute. The kind of stillness that does not ask for permission. The kind that arrives when truth is done waiting. My grandmother rose slowly, not with urgency but with certainty, and the room followed her movement instinctively. Years of being overlooked had taught me to read power differently, and what I felt then was not anger but alignment. She did not come to the center to celebrate. She came to correct. Her presence reframed the entire gathering, transforming it from a performance into a reckoning. My father stood nearby, posture tight, smile fixed, unaware that the foundation beneath him was already cracking. Control only works when memory cooperates, and hers never had. As she stood there, the past seemed to surface all at once. The years before the house, before the money, before the carefully managed narrative. She remembered who paid rent when my father could not. She remembered who held the family together when reputation meant nothing. She remembered the circumstances of my birth, not as a stain, but as a sacrifice that kept the family afloat during its most fragile years. I watched faces shift as she began to unfold history, not with emotion but with precision. Each detail was placed carefully, like evidence that had been waiting patiently for its moment. The room was forced to confront a version of the family story that had been buried beneath convenience. No one interrupted her because interruption would have required denying her authority, and no one was ready to do that. My father's discomfort grew visible. His legacy depended on selective memory, and she was dismantling it piece by piece. He had built his power by deciding who belonged and who did not. She was reminding everyone that belonging was not his to grant or revoke. I stood frozen, heart racing as my name entered the narrative, not as an afterthought, but as a cornerstone. She traced the timeline clearly, showing how my existence intersected with the family's survival, how my mother's contributions had been quietly erased once stability was secured. She revealed how exclusion had been a choice, not a necessity. The room felt heavier with every passing moment, not because of shame but because of recognition. Relatives who had once avoided my gaze now looked directly at me, seeing the full picture for the first time. Friends of the family shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had applauded a story built on omission. My sister, still the celebrated center of the evening, sat silent, her joy dulled by confusion. This was not her fault, and my grandmother made that clear without needing to explain. The correction was aimed upward, not sideways. Accountability belongs where power sits. What struck me most was the calm. There was no bitterness in my grandmother's delivery. No need for validation. She spoke because truth deserved air, not because she wanted applause. That calm made her words impossible to dismiss. Anger can be debated. Memory cannot. My father attempted to reclaim the moment through posture alone, but authority without truth is fragile. His body betrayed him. The tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his hands, the way his eyes avoided mine. For the first time I saw him not as an unmovable figure, but as a man confronted by the cost of his own narrative. When my grandmother finished, she did not wait for approval. She returned to her seat, mission complete. The room remained silent, not out of confusion, but because something irreversible had occurred. The story everyone thought they knew had been corrected, and correction carries weight. I felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Not triumph, not revenge, but grounding. The kind that comes from being placed back into context. I had not been wrong for existing. I had been inconvenient to a story that required erasure. People began approaching me differently after that. Not with pity but with acknowledgement. The invisible line that had separated me from the family blurred, then disappeared. Inclusion, I realized, was not something I needed to earn. It had simply been withheld. My father did not speak to me that night. Silence in this case was not power. It was retreat. He had lost control of the narrative, and with it, the authority he had wielded so carelessly. What remained was accountability, whether he chose to face it or not. As the party slowly resumed its surface-level rhythm, I understood that the celebration had changed meaning. It was no longer about showcasing perfection. It had become a marker, a dividing line between the past and what could no longer be denied. I caught my grandmother's eye across the room. She gave a small nod, not of victory but of completion. Her job was done. The rest would unfold in its own time. This was not the end of the story. It was the moment the truth took its first breath. The next chapter would not be about revelation, but about consequence, and consequences always travel further than words. And as the night wore on, I realized that being told I was not family had never made it true. Bloodlines remember even when people try to forget. The days after the party did not explode the way people expect truth to. There were no dramatic apologies, no immediate reversals, no public confessions. Instead, there was something far more unsettling for those who depended on control. A slow, irreversible shift. Power does not always fall loudly. Sometimes it simply stops responding to the people who once commanded it. The family group chats grew quieter. Conversations that once flowed without question now paused, hesitated, and rerouted. Invitations were reworded. Assumptions were reconsidered. The version of the family my father had curated for years had been punctured, and everyone could feel the air leaking out. No one wanted to be caught defending a story that no longer held. I moved through those days carefully, not out of fear but out of awareness. When truth surfaces, it tests everyone differently. Some rush to repair their image. Others retreat into denial. A few, the rare ones, adjust. I watched them all, finally positioned not on the margins, but at the center of consequence. My father avoided me with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He stayed busy, visible, productive, as if motion could replace authority. Yet every room he entered carried a trace of discomfort. People watched him now instead of following him. That difference mattered. Leadership without trust is just noise. What surprised him most was not my reaction but my restraint. I did not confront him. I did not demand acknowledgement. I did not seek revenge. The truth had already done its work. It had shifted the ground beneath his feet, and no amount of performance could stabilize it again. Silence, when chosen instead of imposed, becomes power. My grandmother remained steady. She did not linger in explanations or revisit the moment she had created. She returned to her routine with the same calm she had carried into the party, as if correcting history was simply another responsibility she had finally checked off her list. When I sat with her, there was no celebration, only understanding. She had not spoken for recognition. She had spoken because lies rot families from the inside. Relatives began reaching out one by one. Some messages were awkward, others overly warm, a few genuinely thoughtful. Each one revealed something about the sender. Some wanted absolution. Some wanted proximity. Some wanted clarity. I gave them none of what they expected. I offered consistency instead. Consistency reveals intention faster than confrontation ever could. My sister, caught between narratives she never asked for, struggled quietly. I did not blame her. She had been raised inside the edited version of our family, just as I had been raised outside it. Neither of us chose our roles. But roles, once exposed, no longer define destiny. I watched her begin to see me not as competition or inconvenience, but as context. That shift mattered more than any apology could. My father's authority continued to erode in small but undeniable ways. Decisions were questioned. Stories were cross-checked. His certainty, once unquestioned, now required validation. The man who had declared who belonged and who did not was being reminded that belonging cannot be dictated by insecurity. At work events, at family gatherings, even casual conversations, people referenced the past differently. They asked questions he could not comfortably answer. They acknowledged contributions he had erased. Each moment was subtle, but together they formed a pattern he could not ignore. The story had changed and he was no longer the narrator. For the first time in my life, I felt no urge to defend myself. I had spent years explaining my existence, justifying my presence, softening my needs. Now I simply existed and the world adjusted. That adjustment felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, but it was also grounding. This is what it feels like, I realized, to stand on truth instead of survival. My grandmother eventually spoke to me about what comes next. Not in instructions but in perspective. She reminded me that exposure is only the beginning. What follows is choice. How people respond to truth reveals who they are willing to become. Some will rise. Some will resist. Some will distance themselves to preserve comfort. None of that is your responsibility. Those words settled deep. I understood then that the story was no longer about proving anything. It was about deciding how much access people deserved to the version of me that had survived their denial. Forgiveness, if it came, would not be automatic. It would be intentional. My father finally attempted to reassert control, not through confrontation but through optics. He organized another gathering, smaller, quieter, designed to restore balance. I was included again, this time more visibly, more intentionally. The invitation felt different not because of sincerity but because of necessity. He needed proximity to legitimacy. I accepted the invitation without emotion. Not as compliance but as observation. Watching people who once dismissed you scramble to reframe you is a kind of clarity no apology can provide. It shows you exactly who they are when the ground shifts. That gathering did not restore his authority. It exposed its absence. The dynamic had changed too much. People no longer looked to him for permission. They looked around instead, checking context, reading the room, aware that truth was now a variable they could not ignore. As I left that evening, I understood something essential. Being told I was not family had shaped my survival, but being proven otherwise had reshaped my future. The difference between those two states is not validation. It is freedom. It was about sovereignty. About choosing how close people could stand once they saw your value too late. Not just of blood, but of voice, space, and truth long overdue. The shift was no longer subtle. By now, it had become a force that could not be ignored. My father's once unquestioned control was fractured, visible to anyone with eyes. The family, long trained to follow his lead, now hesitated, uncertain where allegiance truly lay. His confidence, carefully constructed over decades, was now exposed as fragile, almost performative. The party, the gatherings, even casual mentions of the past, all had become stages where truth quietly but relentlessly undermined him. I moved through this new reality with measured patience. The lesson my grandmother had imparted had taken root. Exposure does not guarantee change, it forces it. And change, when resisted, exacts consequences. I watched closely as every interaction my father attempted to orchestrate faltered. Invitations that had once commanded attention now carried expectation without authority. People looked to me for context, for acknowledgement, for clarity, and I gave them presence instead of permission. The most revealing moments came during family events that had been meticulously curated to reinforce the old hierarchy. He would introduce me with formality, almost as if rehearsing an apology, but the room responded to me, not him. Subtle gestures, glances, nods, seating choices, spoke louder than words. Everyone, even those who had supported him unquestioningly, felt the shift. Loyalty had begun to bend toward reality. My sister, increasingly conscious of the imbalance, began navigating the new dynamic herself. She was not antagonistic. Rather, she was learning to see the truth for herself. Our relationship, long defined by invisible barriers, started to realign. She began to seek counsel subtly, observing my interactions with others, measuring my patience, my restraint, my ability to command attention without entitlement. In that, I realized a queen never asserts herself by force. She asserts by presence. Meanwhile, my grandmother continued her quiet orchestration, speaking when necessary, reminding others of history without confrontation, and letting the weight of truth carry itself. It was not revenge she sought, nor correction for display, but restoration. She made clear that lineage and memory are not negotiable, and when they are ignored, the consequences ripple through generations. As months passed, small but undeniable consequences accumulated. Family decisions that had once excluded me were reconsidered. My opinions were solicited, not demanded, and suddenly influence was returned to me organically. My father attempted to retain control by leaning on appearances, staging meetings, and emphasizing his past contributions, but those performances no longer held sway. People listened, but they listened critically, filtering his words against evidence my grandmother had made undeniable. The most dramatic shift occurred during a private family discussion that had been convened to clarify roles. He attempted, as he always had, to assert authority through assertive tone and selective memory. Yet the room subtly rejected him. Questions arose, probing details he had hoped would remain buried. Corrections appeared in real time, as relatives referenced facts that contradicted his narrative. His frustration was palpable, though he masked it with forced composure. He realized at last that narratives cannot be dictated when the truth already has witnesses. I observed silently, a participant but not a performer. I did not need to dominate the conversation. My presence was enough. The room's attention, subtly but firmly, had shifted. Influence had returned not because I demanded it, but because I embodied the reality he had tried to suppress. Power, I realized, does not require permission. It requires acknowledgement of truth. Even outside family interactions, the ripple effect became visible. Mutual friends, colleagues, and distant relatives who had long deferred to his version of events now approached me directly. They sought insight, guidance, or context. The unspoken understanding was clear. Authority rooted in distortion is transient. Influence grounded in truth endures. Amid all of this, my grandmother remained my compass. She cautioned that power without grace is fragile. She reminded me that patience, observation, and strategic presence were as crucial as memory in sustaining authority. What I had learned from her was that true sovereignty does not need public recognition. It manifests in consistent respect, intentional decisions, and quiet control over the narrative. The culmination of this chapter arrived at another family gathering, one designed to reinforce hierarchy. My father attempted his usual orchestrations, presenting achievements, emphasizing milestones, drawing attention to his perceived sacrifices. But this time the room followed me. Invitations to speak, subtle deference in conversations, even seating arrangements, all indicated the subtle, inexorable transfer of influence. I was no longer a peripheral figure. I was central. My voice, once silenced, now carried weight. My choices were noted. My presence commanded attention. This shift, however, was not without friction. Resistance appeared in small, sharp ways. Dismissive comments, calculated exclusion attempts, and veiled criticism. Yet each act of resistance was neutralized by consistency, composure, and historical evidence. Memory had become my armor. Truth had become my shield. Authority, when rooted in reality, cannot be fabricated, bought, or borrowed. It can only be recognized. By the end of the evening, the family had begun to accept a new hierarchy, not one dictated by age or performance, but by acknowledgement of reality. The man who had once defined family membership now stood as an observer to a story he could no longer control. My grandmother, content in her quiet influence, watched as balance returned naturally, leaving no room for negotiation. The power once withheld had found its rightful place. I walked away that night understanding something profound. Reclaiming influence does not require confrontation. It requires endurance, strategy, patience, and truth. Those who attempt to deny it will falter. Those who attempt to suppress it will be exposed. And those who possess it inherently, as I had always done, only need to exist with awareness and grace. It would not be about proving worth, commanding obedience, or delivering vengeance. It would be about fully stepping into power, claiming space that was always rightfully mine, and observing the natural consequences of truth finally unbound. The air around our family had shifted in ways that could no longer be ignored. What had started as quiet tension after a party had transformed into a full recalibration of authority, respect, and recognition. My father, once a man whose words shaped perception, now moved through the same spaces with visible restraint. Every action was measured, every sentence weighed, because he understood, whether consciously or not, that the narrative had shifted irreversibly. Control had been reclaimed by the one he tried to erase. Me. The culmination arrived on a day that seemed ordinary to everyone else but carried extraordinary weight for me. My grandmother had requested a family gathering, one described simply as a reunion. But this was far more than social convention. It was an opportunity to cement reality, to codify respect, and to let truth stand unchallenged. Invitations were extended neutrally, without favor, without agenda. Those who had once whispered doubts about my place in the family were now compelled to witness a presence they could not ignore. I arrived as I always did now, composed, grounded, and aware of the power that comes from consistent truth. There was no triumph in my stride, no vindication in my posture. Instead, there was authority, calm and undeniable, shaped by decades of observation, endurance, and strategic patience. Eyes that had once avoided me now met mine with acknowledgement, some with surprise, others with reluctant respect. My father entered shortly after, attempting to assert formality, attempting to frame the gathering as a testament to his influence. But the subtle rhythms of power had shifted. The room's attention did not follow his narrative, it followed reality. Seating arrangements, greetings, even the flow of conversation aligned naturally with presence, not performance. In the quietest, most unspoken ways, authority had transferred. My grandmother, the orchestrator of balance, did not speak first. She observed, letting the atmosphere adjust to her intentions. Then, with calm deliberation, she reminded the family of what had been overlooked, ignored, or dismissed for too long. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. She presented facts, memories, and context, letting history speak louder than emotion. It was during this moment that the final reckoning revealed itself. My father's attempts to interject, to reassert influence, to remind others of hierarchy fell flat. Every fact, every recollection, every small truth my grandmother presented aligned with my presence. I was no longer an echo in someone else's story. I was the story itself, visible, undeniable, and central. My sister, observing quietly at first, stepped forward in her own way. Not in challenge but in acknowledgement. She aligned with the truth, recognizing me not as a rival or inconvenience, but as a rightful part of the family narrative. Our eyes met briefly, and I understood the subtle reconciliation that did not require apologies but only recognition. The years of invisible barriers dissolved in that moment. Guests and relatives adjusted naturally. Questions were asked of me directly. Opinions were sought. Contributions that had once been overlooked were now noticed and valued. Even those who had been loyal to my father's selective memory began to recalibrate their perception. The room, once orchestrated around exclusion, had realigned around reality. The final act was quiet but potent. My grandmother placed her hand on mine, a gesture more symbolic than verbal. It was an affirmation, a crown passed without ceremony, but no less powerful for its simplicity. This was acknowledgement, authority restored, legacy recognized. Bloodlines, memory, and truth had converged to crown the rightful heir, not to wealth, not to privilege, but to voice, influence, and sovereignty. From that moment, the dynamics of the family would never be the same. My father retained his life, his achievements, and his past, but he no longer dictated who belonged or who mattered. I had moved beyond exclusion, beyond attempts at erasure, and into presence. Authority no longer relied on fear or selective memory. It rested in consistency, integrity, and the undeniable truth of experience. I realized then that the true crown was not a symbol, nor was it power wielded with aggression. It was the ability to exist fully, unapologetically, and to let truth act as your foundation. Those who tried to suppress it would falter. Those who denied it would witness its quiet ascendancy. And those who recognized it would align, willingly or not, with reality. The final gathering ended without fanfare. No one made grand declarations, no one demanded attention. Yet every gesture, every glance, every acknowledgement carried weight. The room had absorbed the lesson. You cannot erase what exists, you cannot rewrite history, and you cannot suppress the rightful presence of someone who has endured and persisted. As I stepped away, I felt an unfamiliar lightness. There was no lingering doubt, no need for external validation. Recognition had arrived naturally, rooted in truth and reinforced by observation. My grandmother's quiet guidance, my sister's eventual alignment, and the inevitable exposure of my father's limitations had coalesced to restore balance. The crown, once metaphorical, had settled fully, and I wore it effortlessly. And so, the story that began with exclusion and whispered denial concluded with reclamation and sovereignty. The phrase "you're not family," once sharp enough to cut through years of hope, had lost its power entirely. Blood remembers. Memory persists. Truth prevails. And in that quiet yet unstoppable way, the Queen rises, not by proving worth to others, but by existing in alignment with what is always hers. The legacy was clear. The rightful place is never truly taken away, and those who attempt to deny it will ultimately be witnesses, not authors, of your destiny.